Clara was a woman who lived a quiet life in a small town where everyone seemed to know each other's story. She was not rich, she was not dressed in the latest fashion, and she never tried to stand out. People often called her simple, not because she lacked anything important, but because she lived in a way that was plain and humble. She wore modest clothes, spent most of her time working in a little shop, and walked home every evening with her small bag of groceries. Many people passed by her without noticing her, and some even looked down on her, thinking she was not worth much. Yet, what they never knew was that Clara carried something precious deep inside her heart, something that could not be seen from the outside. When Clara was a little girl, her father had been her closest friend and teacher. He had loved music, especially the violin. In their small house, which was old but warm, the sound of his violin had filled the evenings. Clara had watched him play, his fingers moving with such grace, his eyes closing as if the world around him had disappeared. She had asked him one day to teach her, and he had smiled, placing the violin gently into her hands. From that moment on, the violin became more than just an instrument, it became her companion, her way of expressing feelings she could never put into words. After her father passed away, she kept the violin as her most valuable possession. Though it was old and worn, it was the one thing she would never part with. Life was not easy for Clara. She worked long hours, earned little money, and faced the quiet loneliness of living alone. Still, she found comfort each night when she returned home and picked up her violin. She would sit by the small window, look at the sky, and let the bow glide across the strings. Her music was never for applause, never for money, it was for her heart and in memory of her father. Every note carried her joys and her sorrows, her dreams and her struggles. But the world outside her small room never knew this side of Clara. To them, she was just a plain woman with nothing special to offer. One day, Clara received an invitation to attend a community gathering. It was a social event organized by the wealthiest families in town, meant to show off their grand hall and entertain important guests. Clara was surprised to be invited at all, but she thought it might be a good chance to meet people and spend a different kind of evening. She took out her cleanest dress, a simple one she had worn many times before, and polished her shoes until they shined as much as they could. She even carried her violin case with her, not because she expected to play, but because she always felt safer with it by her side. It was as though carrying the violin gave her courage, even in places where she felt she didn't belong. When she entered the hall, she immediately felt the difference between herself and the others. The wealthy women were dressed in sparkling gowns, their hair styled perfectly, their jewelry catching the light from the chandeliers. The men wore sharp suits and spoke in loud voices, laughing and shaking hands. Clara walked in quietly, keeping to the side, and tried to find a corner where she would not disturb anyone. But her presence did not go unnoticed. A few women near the front spotted her and began whispering to one another. They looked at her plain dress, her old shoes, and the violin case in her hand, and smirked. "Why is she even here?" one of them whispered. "She probably thinks she belongs among us," another said with a laugh. "And look at that violin case, how funny! Does she really think she can play?" The women chuckled, their eyes full of mockery. They had no idea that Clara was skilled, they assumed the instrument was nothing more than an old prop. Wanting to have a laugh at her expense, one of the women suddenly spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "Clara, isn't it? You've brought a violin. How wonderful! Why don't you play for us?" The room turned to look at Clara. She froze, clutching the handle of her violin case. She had not expected this. She hadn't come to show off or to draw attention. She had only come to be polite, to attend like everyone else. But now all eyes were on her. The wealthy women smiled in a way that was not kind, waiting for her to make a fool of herself. Clara's heart began to race, and for a moment, she thought about refusing. She thought about shaking her head and sitting down quietly, but then she remembered her father's voice, "Never be afraid to play. Music speaks louder than words." With a deep breath, Clara slowly walked toward the stage. The crowd watched with anticipation. Some were already whispering, "This will be amusing," while others leaned back in their chairs, ready to laugh. Clara placed the violin case on the table, opened it carefully, and lifted out the old wooden violin. Its surface had scratches, its strings were not shiny, but in her hands, it looked like the most treasured object in the world. She held it with care, as though it were alive. The hall grew quiet for a moment, but the quiet was filled with judgment, not respect. People expected her to fail, to scratch out some ugly sounds that would make her run off stage in embarrassment. Clara could feel their doubt pressing down on her like a heavy weight. Her hands trembled slightly as she tuned the strings. She could see the mocking eyes of the women who had dared her to play, their lips curled into satisfied smirks. Yet, inside her chest, something else was stirring courage. Clara closed her eyes for a second and whispered in her heart, "This is for you, Papa." Then she lifted the bow. The very first note floated through the air. It was soft but steady, like a voice that had finally found the courage to speak. The sound surprised the crowd. It was not clumsy, not unpleasant, it was pure and filled with emotion. Clara felt her nerves begin to fade as the music took over. She played the next note, and then the next, each one flowing smoothly into the other. The hall that had moments before been buzzing with whispers and laughter began to fall silent. People leaned forward, listening, almost unwillingly, because the music had caught their hearts. Clara kept playing, her bow gliding gracefully, her fingers dancing across the strings. In that moment, she was no longer the simple woman in a plain dress. She was a storyteller, a dreamer, an artist. She poured her entire soul into the violin, letting it speak for her. The audience, who had expected to laugh, now sat frozen in surprise. Something had changed in the room, though Clara had only just begun. As Clara stood on the stage, her violin resting on her shoulder, the large hall filled with the faint echo of her first notes. The audience, who only moments earlier had expected nothing more than a clumsy attempt, leaned forward with surprise. They had imagined harsh sounds, broken strings, or perhaps a few awkward squeaks that would send the simple woman running off the stage in shame. Instead, what they heard was the soft beginning of a melody that touched the room like a gentle breeze. It was quiet at first, almost like a whisper, but there was something different in it, something honest, something real. The wealthy women who had mocked her at the beginning shifted in their seats. They exchanged uncertain glances, but their lips still curved with disbelief. "It's only the start," one of them whispered to the other. "Let's see how long she lasts." They tried to keep their smug expressions, but already their confidence was cracking. They hadn't expected even a decent sound from Clara, and here she was, holding the room in stillness. Clara's hands, though slightly trembling when she began, soon grew steadier with each note. She thought of her father again, the way he had guided her small fingers across the strings when she was just a girl. He used to tell her, "The violin is not just wood and strings, it is a voice. Let it speak, and it will tell people what you cannot say." Those words carried her now, and though the crowd was filled with people who never truly respected her, she played as though she was speaking directly to them, not with words but with the language of music. The sound grew fuller, rising and falling, weaving through the air. It was not the polished perfection of a professional stage performer, it was deeper than that. It was the sound of a soul pouring itself into every note. People in the back of the hall, who had been chatting among themselves, slowly stopped their conversations. Heads turned toward the stage. The laughter that had once filled the corners of the room was replaced with silence, the kind of silence that comes when people are unexpectedly moved by something they cannot explain. Clara's eyes remained closed for a moment as her bow glided smoothly. She was no longer thinking of the crowd, nor the women who had set her up for humiliation. She was remembering the nights in her little house, where she had played to the stars outside her window. She thought of her father's hands, his smile, his encouragement. She thought of the struggles she had faced, the times she had felt invisible and unwanted, the times people ignored her existence. All of those feelings now found their way into the music. The violin sang her story, her loneliness, her pain, her hope, and her strength. The people in the hall felt it. Some had not expected to be touched so deeply by a tune played on an old violin. But there it was, wrapping around them, entering their hearts quietly, without asking permission. Even the men who had been sipping wine and chatting about business leaned forward in their seats, their glasses forgotten. The wealthy ladies who had started the joke no longer smiled. Their eyes darted from Clara to the audience, noticing how everyone was listening with growing respect. Clara's dress was plain, her shoes worn, and her hair not styled like the other women's. Yet, at that moment, none of it mattered. She stood in the middle of a glowing stage, and she was commanding the attention of every person in the room, not with power, not with money, but with the honesty of her music. It was something they could not buy, something they could not fake. One little girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, she plays so beautifully." The mother, who earlier had thought Clara looked out of place, found her eyes welling with unexpected tears. She simply nodded, unable to answer. The sound of the violin reminded her of memories long forgotten, of moments from her own childhood when music had filled her home. Clara's playing awakened emotions that many in the room had buried beneath their wealth and pride. As the melody swelled, Clara's confidence grew. She let the notes rise higher, filling every corner of the hall. Her bow moved with grace, her fingers dancing across the strings as if the violin were an extension of her own body. She played not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been looked down upon, everyone who had ever been told they were less. Her music spoke of quiet dignity, of hidden strength, of beauty that is often ignored because it doesn't shine on the surface. The wealthy women began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They had wanted Clara to be laughed at, but now they were the ones who felt the sting of shame. Their whispers had stopped. Their proud faces looked pale under the chandelier light. They realized that in trying to mock her, they had given her the stage to reveal the greatness they never imagined she had. Clara finally opened her eyes and looked out into the crowd. She saw them, hundreds of faces staring at her in awe, their expressions softened, their pride humbled. Her heart beat fast, but not from fear anymore. It was from the thrill of sharing her gift, from the realization that her father's words were true, music could speak louder than anything else. She drew the bow again, letting the sound carry to the very back of the hall, where even the servants and staff had stopped their work to listen. The hall felt transformed. The chandeliers sparkled as if they too were alive with the music. The marble floors reflected the sound as though the entire building had become part of the performance. People leaned forward, some with open mouths, others with hands pressed to their chests. A few even had tears rolling down their cheeks, though they quickly wiped them away, embarrassed to be caught showing emotion in such a grand place. Clara's simple violin, old and scratched, now sounded like the finest instrument in the world. It was not its appearance that mattered but the heart of the one who played it. Every stroke of the bow was like a message, every vibration of the strings a reminder that greatness often hides in places no one expects. She continued to play, the melody shifting from soft sadness to hopeful strength. It was as if she was telling a story through the notes, her story, though the audience did not know the details. They only felt it. The sadness, the struggle, the strength, and finally, the rising hope. Each part of the melody touched something different in their hearts. And in that moment, the once noisy hall became a sacred place. The mockery, the laughter, the whispers of superiority, all of it vanished into silence. All that remained was Clara, her violin, and the sound that carried every heart into another world. By the time she reached the middle of her piece, Clara no longer saw the wealthy women as enemies. She no longer felt fear of their laughter. She simply felt free to share what had always been hidden inside her. Her father's gift was alive in her hands, and for the first time, she realized it was not just for her private moments at home. It was meant to be shared, to remind others of something deeper than wealth and pride. The audience, who had come expecting an ordinary evening of chatter and display, now sat in the grip of something they had not planned. They were caught in the honesty of a woman they had underestimated. And though Clara had only begun her song, already the hall was filled with a sense of wonder that no one could deny. The longer Clara played, the deeper the silence in the hall grew. The audience had begun by listening with surprise, but now they listened with their hearts. Her music was no longer just sound, it had become a story told without words. Every rise of the bow, every trembling string seemed to carry feelings that touched the people sitting in those velvet chairs. Some felt as if they were being reminded of lost loves, others of childhood memories, others of quiet struggles they had long hidden from the world. Even the men who had entered the evening expecting nothing more than drinks and business talk sat completely still. A man who had crossed his legs in boredom earlier now leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at Clara as though he had never heard music before. A woman who had been whispering with her friends about Clara's plain dress now sat frozen, her eyes moist as she tried to swallow the lump rising in her throat. The sound of the violin was not perfect in the polished sense, but it was powerful in the emotional sense, and that was what mattered. Clara herself was lost in her performance. She no longer saw faces or eyes staring at her. She no longer remembered the laughter and mocking voices that had pushed her onto the stage. All she felt was the weight of her father's memory guiding her, as if his hands were still over hers, helping her draw every note out of the old strings. The hall disappeared in her mind. She was once again a little girl sitting by the window, playing to the stars, speaking her heart through music. And yet, while she was lost in her own world, the audience was being carried into it with her. They felt her loneliness when the melody dipped low, soft and trembling. They felt her hope when the notes rose higher, climbing like a bird trying to break free from a cage. They felt her quiet strength when she let the sound linger, holding the bow steady with confidence that came from years of practice alone in the dark. Each shift in the song took them on a journey, and they followed without resistance. The wealthy women who had started the cruel joke now sat in unease. At first, they had tried to smile and hide their discomfort, but as the minutes passed, the truth could no longer be ignored. They had underestimated Clara, not just a little, but completely. They had wanted to laugh at her, but instead they were being forced to look at themselves, to see their own pettiness and cruelty reflected back at them in the mirror of her strength. One of them lowered her head, unable to meet the eyes of anyone else. Another twisted the ring on her finger nervously, wishing she had never spoken Clara's name. Meanwhile, the hall was wrapped in the magic of Clara's music. The chandeliers seemed to shine brighter, as though reflecting the glow of something invisible. The polished marble floors echoed softly, almost like another instrument joining in. Even the staff, the waiters, the cleaners, the doormen had stopped their quiet duties and stood at the back, their faces filled with awe. They were used to being ignored in that place, but tonight they were witnesses to a moment none of them would forget. Clara's bow moved with increasing passion. She poured into the violin everything she had carried for years, the sadness of being unseen, the joy of small victories, the heartbreak of losing her father, the strength she found when no one else was there to guide her. The music was alive with all of it. She thought to herself, "This is who I am. This is what I have always been." And though she did not speak it aloud, the crowd felt the same message flowing through their hearts. Some closed their eyes as they listened, letting the music fill the space inside them. A man in the front row, one of the wealthiest in town, found himself remembering his mother's gentle lullabies from his childhood. A woman sitting beside him remembered her first dance as a young girl, when life had felt simple and full of promise. People who had entered the hall proudly showing off their clothes and jewelry now sat humbled, realizing that true beauty could come from a place they had overlooked, a woman they had dismissed. Clara reached a part of the song where the notes trembled with such emotion that it was almost too much to bear. The sound was not loud, but it carried the weight of sorrow that seemed to press on everyone's hearts. Tears slipped quietly down the cheeks of some in the crowd, though they quickly wiped them away, embarrassed to be seen. But no matter how hard they tried, the music had already touched them too deeply to ignore. Then, just as the sorrow threatened to overwhelm, Clara shifted the melody. The violin sang with hope, brightening like the first light of dawn after a long night. The sound rose higher, stronger, freer, filling the room with energy that lifted spirits. The sudden change made the audience breathe again, as though they too had been trapped in sadness and were now being freed. A few gasps could be heard, not of shock, but of relief, of joy, of wonder. At that moment, Clara finally opened her eyes again. She saw the hall clearly, the frozen faces, the shining eyes, the tears, the stillness. It struck her how powerful music could be, how it had the strength to move even those who had once laughed at her. She had not come to prove anything. She had not come to show her worth. Yet here she was, doing exactly that without meaning to. The wealthy women's smirks had vanished completely. They sat pale, almost invisible, while Clara, whom they had thought was unworthy, shone in the center of the stage. They could not escape the truth. They had tried to break her dignity, and instead, she had revealed a dignity greater than their wealth could ever buy. The music swirled and soared, filling every corner of the hall. People sat motionless, not wanting to miss a single note. It was as if time itself had stopped, as though the clocks had chosen to pause and honor Clara's performance. The air felt heavy with emotion, the kind that presses on the chest and leaves people speechless. When the last part of the melody approached, Clara's bow slowed slightly, her fingers guiding the violin into a softer, gentler sound. She wanted to end not with a scream of pride, but with a whisper of truth. The notes fell like quiet raindrops, delicate and peaceful, as if she was telling the audience that her story was not one of bitterness but of endurance, of love, of hope that never dies. The final note lingered, trembling in the air. Clara held the bow still, letting the sound fade naturally, as if it were saying goodbye on its own. She lowered the violin slowly, her heart pounding, her breath heavy from the intensity of what she had just shared. For a moment, there was silence, not the silence of doubt, not the silence of mockery, but the silence of people who had been changed. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like forever. Then, the hall erupted. Applause thundered from every corner. People stood from their seats, clapping so hard that their hands turned red. Some shouted bravo. Others cried out for more. The very people who had expected her to fail were now begging her to continue. Clara stood there, overwhelmed, her violin still in her hand. She had not expected any of this. She had only wanted to honor her father, to stay true to herself. But now, she saw faces looking at her with respect, admiration, even awe. The wealthy women could not clap at first. Their hands remained still, but as the audience around them stood, they realized they had no choice. They joined in reluctantly, though their hearts were filled with shame. They had tried to make a joke out of Clara, but instead they had given her the stage that revealed her greatness. Clara bowed her head humbly, her eyes glistening. She had not spoken a single word, but she had told her entire story that night. And as the applause grew louder, she felt something deep inside her. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the simple woman. She was Clara, the violinist who had left an entire hall speechless. The applause seemed endless. Clara stood still on the stage, holding her violin close to her chest as if it were her father's hand. Her heart raced, her breath uneven, but her spirit was calm. She had poured out everything she had inside her, and the people who had once doubted her now shouted for more. The sound of clapping echoed off the walls and rose toward the glittering chandeliers, filling the grand hall with an energy that no one had expected at the start of the evening. For a moment, Clara thought she might faint, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming rush of emotions. She had spent her life in the background, unnoticed, ignored, even ridiculed. And now, in this single night, she was at the center of everyone's attention, not because of wealth or beauty, but because of her gift. She had not dressed in jewels, she had not walked in with importance, yet she had touched something in people that all the riches in the room could not buy. People continued clapping, their faces glowing with admiration. Some shouted for her to play again. A man in the front row, known for being strict and hard to please, stood to his feet and called out, "Encore!" His voice carried across the hall, and soon others joined in. "Encore! Encore!" The call grew louder, rising like a wave until the entire audience was chanting for her to return to the violin. Clara felt her eyes well up with tears. She had not prepared for this. She had only carried her violin because it was her comfort, her safety. Yet here she was, being begged for more by people who had once thought she was nothing. Slowly, she raised her bow again. The crowd quieted instantly, leaning forward in their seats, their excitement pressing into the silence like a held breath. Clara smiled softly, just a small curve of her lips, before she let the violin sing again. This time she chose a tune her father used to play often, a melody of joy and freedom. The notes were lighter, brighter, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. People swayed slightly in their seats, their smiles widening, their hearts lifted. Children in the audience clapped their hands along softly to the rhythm. An old man near the back wiped his eyes, whispering to the person beside him, "It's been years since I've heard music like this." Even the staff at the edges of the room smiled, grateful to witness a moment of such purity. The hall that had once been filled with whispers of judgment now rang with unity. For a few minutes, everyone was the same: rich, poor, proud, humble, all equal under the spell of Clara's violin. When she finished her second piece, the applause was even greater. People stood once more, clapping until their palms stung, some stamping their feet against the polished floor. Clara bowed her head, overwhelmed by the waves of appreciation crashing over her. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her plain dress or her modest life, but for her true self. Her heart whispered, "Papa, I did it." They finally see. The wealthy women who had started it all sat stiff in their chairs. They clapped, but their faces were pale, their pride shattered. One of them whispered angrily, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Another replied quietly, "We only made ourselves look foolish." They lowered their eyes, wishing the ground would swallow them. The very people they had hoped to impress were now looking past them, clapping for Clara, a woman they had mocked. Their own laughter had turned into their humiliation. After a long moment, the host of the event, a man dressed in fine clothes and known for his powerful voice, stepped forward. He raised his hand, and the applause slowly faded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly, "tonight we have witnessed something truly extraordinary. A reminder that greatness often comes from where we least expect it. Clara, thank you for sharing your gift with us." His words brought another burst of applause. Clara lowered her head humbly, her cheeks glowing red. She was not used to praise. She only knew how to live quietly, modestly. But now, she realized, perhaps her gift was not meant to remain hidden. People began to approach her after she stepped down from the stage. One after another, strangers shook her hand, thanked her, praised her. "You moved me to tears. You reminded me of my youth. That was the most beautiful music I've heard in years." Their words felt surreal to Clara. She smiled politely, her voice soft, her answers simple, but inside, her heart was racing with joy. She had never dreamed of such a moment. Even those who had ignored her earlier now pushed forward to be near her. A woman in a sparkling gown, who had not even looked at Clara when she entered, now held Clara's hand and said, "You must perform at my daughter's wedding." A man who ran the town's concert hall offered, "If you would like, we can arrange a recital. People must hear you." Clara blinked in surprise. These were opportunities she had never thought possible. Yet here they were, handed to her simply because she had dared to play. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the wealthy women who had forced her to play stood quietly, wishing no one would notice them. They felt the sting of guilt, but also envy. They had spent their lives trying to shine, but in one night, Clara's light had outshone them without effort. They whispered among themselves, trying to come up with excuses. Perhaps she practiced for this. Perhaps she got lucky. But their excuses sounded weak even to their own ears. Deep down, they knew the truth. They had tried to make her small, but instead they had revealed her greatness. Clara, however, was not thinking about them anymore. She was too caught up in the kindness now surrounding her. People who had once passed her by in the street without a second glance were now treating her with admiration. She felt almost dizzy from the change. Yet she remained humble, her voice soft, her answers simple. She did not brag. She did not act proud. She only thanked them quietly, clutching her violin case close, as though it were the anchor keeping her grounded. That night, Clara walked home under the stars, her violin case swinging gently at her side. The streets were quiet, but her heart was full of music and joy. She replayed the evening in her mind, the doubtful faces, the silence, the applause, the standing ovation. She could hardly believe it had all been real. She whispered again to the sky, "Papa, I hope you heard me." She felt certain he had. In the days that followed, the story of the simple woman who stunned the hall with her violin spread quickly through the town. People who had never spoken to Clara before greeted her warmly in the streets. Shopkeepers treated her with respect. Children asked her about the violin, begging her to play for them. Invitations arrived for her to perform at gatherings, weddings, and even concerts. Clara was amazed by how much had changed in such a short time. She had lived for years in silence, unnoticed, and now people were asking for her music everywhere she went. But what mattered most to Clara was not the fame or attention. It was the fact that people had listened, that they had felt something real, something true. Her father's gift had finally reached others, not just her. That was what made her heart swell with pride. She continued to live simply, in the same small house, wearing the same modest clothes. But now, when she walked down the street, people looked at her differently. They saw not just a plain woman, they saw a musician, an artist, someone with a gift that could move hearts. The women who had mocked her kept their distance. They could not bear to face the truth of what they had done. But their silence was its own confession. Everyone in the town knew the story, and no one admired them for it. Clara had not only defended her dignity, she had also taught a lesson that night, a lesson the town would not forget. Clara's violin had spoken for her, and it had said everything she had never dared to say aloud, that true worth is not found in riches or appearances, but in the heart, in the passion, in the hidden talents that wait quietly until the right moment to shine. And on that unforgettable evening, Clara had shone brighter than anyone in the hall. The night of the performance had ended, but its memory lingered in the hearts of everyone who had been present. For Clara, it felt almost like a dream. She had walked home quietly, the same as always, yet she was not the same woman who had left her house earlier that evening. Something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt invisible, no longer felt small. She had stood in front of the people who had mocked her, and she had shown them the truth of who she was, not with words or arguments, but with music. And now, she carried that new strength inside her, like a flame that could not be put out. The following morning, Clara woke early, as she always did. She made herself a simple breakfast of bread and tea, then sat by her window with her violin resting on her lap. She ran her fingers over the worn wood, smiling to herself. "We did well," she whispered softly to the instrument, as if it could hear her. "Papa would be proud." She played a gentle tune, not for an audience this time, but for herself, filling her small home with a sound that reminded her that no matter what the world thought, music had always been her closest companion. But outside, the world was already buzzing with talk about her. In the town square, people gathered and spoke of the simple woman who had left the grand hall in silence before filling it with thunderous applause. Shopkeepers repeated the story to their customers. Families who had been there told neighbors what they had seen. Even those who had not witnessed it firsthand now spoke of Clara as if they had known her all along. Her name spread quickly, and so did the respect that had once been missing from her life. When Clara went to the market that day, she noticed the difference immediately. Where people once passed her without a glance, they now greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Clara," the baker said with a wide smile. "Your performance was unforgettable." The woman who sold flowers offered her a small bouquet for free. Even the children, usually too busy chasing each other around the fountain, stopped to look at her with admiration. "You play the violin so beautifully," one little boy said shyly. Clara bent down and smiled at him. "Thank you," she answered softly, touched by the innocence of his words. In the days that followed, letters began arriving at her door. Some were invitations to play at weddings, others to perform at concerts in nearby towns. A few were simply letters of gratitude from strangers who had heard about her performance. One note read, "Your music reminded me of my mother's love. Thank you for bringing her memory back to me." Another said, "I walked into the hall that night proud and full of myself, but I walked out humbled. You taught us all a lesson." Clara read these letters with tears in her eyes. She had never sought fame, never dreamed of it. Yet her violin had touched people in ways she never expected. Despite the sudden attention, Clara remained herself. She still lived in her modest home, still wore her plain clothes, still carried her old violin case wherever she went. But now she walked with a quiet confidence. People no longer saw her as someone to mock, they saw her as a reminder that true value cannot be measured by wealth or appearance. Wherever she went, respect followed her, though she never demanded it. The wealthy women who had forced her to play kept silent. They avoided her in public, ashamed of how their cruelty had backfired. Some of them tried to act as if they had always supported her, but everyone in town knew the truth. Their faces burned with embarrassment whenever the story was told. In the end, they became the example of what happens when people judge others too quickly. Clara did not hate them, nor did she seek revenge. She simply let her music speak, and that was enough. Over time, Clara accepted some of the invitations to perform. She played at weddings, bringing joy to couples on the happiest days of their lives. She played at small gatherings, where families sat close together and listened with shining eyes. She even stood on larger stages in nearby towns, though she never allowed herself to forget where she came from. Each time she played, she remembered her father's words and the nights they had shared music together in their little home. No matter how big the stage, she played with the same heart. Her fame grew, but she never let it change her. When people offered her riches, she smiled and shook her head. "I play for love, not for gold," she would say. Her life remained simple, yet it was filled with meaning. For the first time, she felt that she was living the purpose her father had always hoped for her. And the people never forgot that night in the grand hall. They told the story to their children, who told it to theirs. It became a lesson passed down in the town: never judge someone by what they wear, where they live, or how they appear. Greatness can hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right moment to shine. Clara's story became part of the town's history, a reminder that kindness and respect should never be withheld, because the quietest person in the room might hold the most beautiful gift. Years later, when Clara grew older, she continued to play her violin each evening by the window. Neighbors would gather outside, listening to her music drifting into the night air. She did not need the applause anymore, nor the invitations, nor the praise. She played because it was who she was, and because it made her feel close to her father. Children would sit on the steps outside her house, listening in silence, their young hearts touched by the sound. For them, she was not just a woman with a violin, she was a teacher, a friend, a symbol of hope. One evening, after finishing a gentle piece, Clara looked out of her window at the stars. She remembered that night at the hall as if it had happened yesterday: the mocking smiles, the heavy silence, the eruption of applause. It had been the night that changed everything, the night that gave her voice to the world. She smiled softly and whispered, "Thank you, Papa, for the gift." Her heart was full, knowing she had lived her life with honesty and purpose. The memory of Clara's performance remained alive long after her violin fell silent. People spoke of her with respect, telling her story to remind others never to underestimate the quiet ones, never to laugh at those who seem plain. And every time someone repeated her story, they ended the same way: she was forced to play to be mocked, but when she played, she left the audience speechless. That was Clara's legacy: not wealth, not status, but the power of truth expressed through music. And it was a legacy that would never fade, because once music touches the heart, it remains there forever.